Frank Castle had followed men like these across half the world. Gun runners, traffickers, smugglers, enforcers with polished shoes and dead eyes. In every country they called themselves by different names, but their business was always the same. Fear was their currency. Flesh was their product. Blood was what they spilled when somebody failed them. Frank had spent years learning how networks like that breathed. First came whispers in port cities. Then came bodies in alleyways. Then came the money moving through hands too clean to belong to the street. By the time he reached the outskirts of Budapest, he believed he was closing in on another cartel with foreign backing and military discipline. Then he found the first room. It was hidden beneath an abandoned textile warehouse, behind a steel door thick enough to stop a breaching charge. The guards outside had been armed like private soldiers, but inside there were no crates, no ledgers, no hostages waiting to be sold. There were only corpses arranged in silence. Men with their throats open so neatly it looked ceremonial. Women collapsed against walls with their skin gray and empty. A smell of iron hung in the air, but the floor was almost clean. Too clean. The blood was missing, not spilled. Frank crouched beside the nearest body and stared at the wounds. No hesitation cuts, no jagged knife work. 2 punctures. Deep, precise. He had seen torture chambers, execution sites, and mafia burn houses. This was none of them. Whatever had happened here was organized, efficient, and utterly alien to the logic of ordinary men. By dawn, he found another site 2 streets over. This time the dead were not drained. They were shredded, arms torn from sockets, rib cages split open, concrete walls scored by impact marks that looked less like gunfire and more like something had slammed living bodies through stone. One security camera was still running from an emergency backup battery. Frank pulled the drive, watched the footage in the dark of a stolen van, and saw a blur move through the frame faster than the eye could hold. Muzzles flashed. Men screamed. Then shapes crashed into the gunman from above, and the screen died under a spray of black static and red mist. Most people would have called the police, or the military, or a priest. Frank loaded fresh magazines. The trail led below the city, through maintenance tunnels and old railway veins forgotten by maps. The deeper he went, the more the air changed. It grew colder, not with weather but with absence, as if warmth itself avoided the place. He passed symbols burned into brick, old blood circles, chains bolted into walls, weapon crates stamped with markings from companies that did not officially exist. Somebody had built an underground front line beneath the sleeping city. Then the war revealed itself. It began with gunfire echoing ahead in hard metallic bursts. Frank moved toward it with the same steady pace he had once taken through Fallujah streets under mortar fire. He reached a broken overlook above a cavernous transit platform and looked down into madness. 2 armies were killing each other in the dark. One side moved like living shadows in long black armor, pale faces flashing between rifle bursts, their grace too sharp, too fluid, every motion impossibly clean. The other side hit like avalanches of muscle and rage, some in human form, others changing mid-charge into towering beasts of bone, fur, and exposed hunger. Automatic weapons barked. Blades flashed silver. A creature the size of a horse crashed through a concrete column while a woman in leather landed on its back and drove twin shots into its skull before vaulting away from another lunging shape. Frank had seen drug psychosis, cult warfare, and men butcher each other over flags and gods. He had never seen this. Vampires and Lycans were not words he used, because words like that belonged to stories told to children. But whatever names the world gave them, he understood one truth instantly. They were predators. They had hidden behind human corruption, feeding on it, steering it, using entire cities as camouflage for a private apocalypse. A wounded thing crawled toward a fallen mercenary below, jaws opening over the man's face. Frank fired. The first round punched through its eye. The next 3 broke its spine against the platform. Heads turned in every direction. For a single second the cavern paused, both factions looking up toward the catwalk where one human stood with an assault rifle in his hands, and no fear in his posture. Frank answered their confusion with grenades. Explosions rolled through the station, scattering pale killers and furred monsters alike. He dropped to one knee, controlled his breathing, and began firing in disciplined bursts. A vampire leaped 20 feet and lost half its skull. A Lycan rushed the stairwell and met armor-piercing rounds through the mouth. The second creature slammed into the railing, climbed anyway, and Frank put a combat knife into its throat before kicking the body back into the battle below. To everyone else in that abyss, the war had rules, ancient loyalties, blood debts, hierarchies older than nations. Frank Castle did not care. He had come hunting criminals. Instead, he had found a hidden species war feeding on the innocent beneath an unsuspecting city. That only simplified the mission. Monsters, smugglers, immortals, beasts. It made no difference. In Frank's world, if you preyed on the helpless, you died. And in the underworld beneath Budapest, every side had just made the mistake of showing him where they lived. The first lesson Frank learned was simple. Shoot a vampire in the chest and it kept coming. Shoot a Lycan in the chest and it came faster. In the hours after the battle beneath the platform, Frank moved through service tunnels with the city map alive in his head, changing direction every few minutes, doubling back through maintenance shafts, listening for pursuit. He heard it long before he saw it. Footsteps too light to be human, then heavier impacts that shook rust from the ceiling. Two hunting styles, two species, same conclusion. The man on the catwalk had become a problem. They should have killed him in minutes. Instead, they met a soldier who understood that survival had never belonged to the strongest. It belonged to the one still thinking after the ambush began. A pale gunman caught him first near a defunct pumping station, moving out of shadow with a submachine gun raised. Frank fired before the muzzle cleared, but the figure twisted aside with impossible speed. Bullets sparked off pipe. The vampire smiled, almost insulted, then rushed him. Frank baited the angle, fell back behind a support pillar, and hit the dead man's switch in his palm. The maintenance floor erupted. Fuel gel and scrap metal turned the corridor into a furnace. The vampire screamed inside the bloom of fire, slamming blind into the wall, while Frank advanced through the smoke and emptied a magazine into its skull at point-blank range. That was the second lesson. Speed could be misled. A Lycan pack taught him the third. They cornered him above an old drainage canal, where the walls narrowed and the air stank of mildew and old bones. 5 of them, maybe 6. Human silhouettes at first, shoulders hunched, eyes shining like lamps in the dark. They circled without urgency because predators like to feel inevitable. Frank let them. He backed toward a service ladder, breathing hard enough to look tired, favoring his left leg to sell weakness. When the first one lunged, the others surged with it. Frank ripped the pin. Flash charges burst from magnetic clamps he had seated on the railings during his retreat. White light flooded the tunnel. Enhanced eyes burned. The pack howled. Frank was already moving, dropping from the ladder to a lower maintenance ledge as fragmentation charges cooked off overhead. Steel screamed. One Lycan fell in pieces. Another crashed into the canal and did not rise. A third, half blind and furious, tried to leap the gap. Frank met it with a shotgun loaded with silver buck that he had stolen from a vampire cache he barely understood. The blast tore the creature backward through the air. That was the third lesson. If monsters had weaknesses, they could be studied. So Frank studied. He stripped weapons from corpses and broke down ammunition under bare bulbs in forgotten rooms. He watched security footage frame by frame. He noted how vampires fought with discipline and contempt, how Lycans fought with explosive force and waves of momentum. He learned the difference between a patrol route and a feeding route. He marked sewer exits, safe houses, black market clinics, abandoned churches used as drop points, and armored vans that never appeared on public traffic records. The city became a battlefield diagram. Soon the impossible thing happened. He began winning. Not cleanly, never easily. A vampire once crossed 15 feet between heartbeats and carved a line across Frank's ribs before Frank decapitated him with a rigged tram door. A Lycan smashed through reinforced cover and broke 2 of Frank's fingers before he detonated the support beams above them both. Every encounter hurt. Every victory cost blood, breath, cartilage, sleep. But the human kept surviving, and survival was a language ancient killers respected whether they admitted it or not. Whispered through both factions. Some called him a mercenary. Some called him an assassin hired by a rival clan. Others believed he was cursed or protected or insane beyond any useful category. Reports kept returning with the same detail. He did not run when he should have. He did not bargain when cornered. He did not panic at the sight of claws or fangs. He hunted back. A vampire surveillance team found an entire nest burned with ultraviolet lamps wired into the electrical grid. A Lycan raiding party entered a warehouse and triggered overlapping kill zones so precise that the survivors thought they had faced a military unit. Not one wounded man with tape over his knuckles and a dead family in his memory. They began adjusting their operations around him. That was when Frank knew he had crossed from trespasser to threat. He could feel it in the silence before attacks, in the caution that replaced arrogance, in the fact that creatures older and stronger than him were now planning around one human moving through their war like a blade. They thought fear made men retreat. They did not yet understand what Frank Castle became when fear stopped mattering. Selene first saw him through a rifle scope. He was kneeling beside a dead Lycan in the shell of a bombed wine cellar, gloved hands searching pockets, collar, gums, wounds, every detail treated like evidence instead of horror. He did not move like prey. Prey checked the dark and hoped not to be noticed. This man studied the dead as if the night itself had made a mistake by leaving clues behind. She had followed rumors for 3 nights before finding him. A human striking vampire couriers. Lycan scouts disappearing from routes they had used safely for decades. Safehouses sabotaged with methods too crude for elders and too effective for amateurs. At first she assumed the reports were inflated by panic. Then she saw the bodies herself, each kill tailored to its target with an efficiency that suggested military training and a hatred stripped of all ceremony. Now she watched him rise from the corpse and scan the street above through a fractured ceiling. There was no hesitation in him, only calculation. Selene knew obsession when she saw it. Entire covens had been built on lesser forms of it. But his did not resemble ambition, revenge politics, or the cold vanity of immortals pretending their endless lives gave them meaning. His obsession was brutally simple. Find the guilty, learn the pattern, continue until nothing dangerous remained. He reminded her of a weapon left loaded after the battle ended. She tracked him through rain and alleys, across rooftops and service passages, never closing enough to trigger his instincts for more than a flicker. Even so, twice he paused and glanced into darkness so directly that Selene wondered if he had sensed her heartbeat. Once he entered a derelict hospital used by Lycan intermediaries. She expected surveillance. Instead, she watched him plant charges only on the support points that would bury the armed men inside while leaving the lower wards intact. Civilians were hiding there, addicts and migrants paying for shelter with silence. He spared them without softness. He simply refused to include them in the kill zone. That interested her more than the bodies. Later, in a ruined tram depot, she watched him ambush a vampire retrieval team sent to secure blood stores before dawn. He moved like a man already injured, stiff through the shoulders, one step slower than he should have been. Yet every weakness became bait. The first guard died reaching for him. The second was pushed into a hanging cable Frank had stripped live from the depot wall. When the third vaulted from the catwalk, Frank turned before the landing and drove a silver-edged spike through the vampire's jaw with both hands, pinning it to the concrete. No rage, just work. Selene had spent centuries among killers who clothed violence in ritual, ideology, or family myth. This man used none of those disguises. He killed because he had decided the target deserved death. The certainty of it was disturbing. So she finally stepped into his line of sight. It happened beneath an overpass where old flood tunnels met the river. Frank emerged from the dark, carrying a duffel bag of stolen weapons, and stopped the instant he saw her. Not surprised, not afraid, simply still. Selene felt the air sharpen between them. He looked at her armor, her stance, the pistols at her sides, and understood enough. "You are one of them," he said. Selene did not raise her guns. "Not yet. That depends on what you think them means." He set the bag down without taking his eyes off her. "Anyone helping them?" A faint bitterness passed through her expression. "Then you understand very little." Frank's answer came flat and immediate. "I understand dead civilians. Drained bodies, missing people. I understand things hiding under cities while humans pay the price." Rain tapped against the tunnel mouth. Somewhere above, traffic moved over the sleeping river. Selene studied his face, the scars, the exhaustion pressed into him like old metal. There was something dangerous in men who had accepted death. There was something more dangerous in men who no longer cared whether they lived long enough to see victory. "You cannot kill your way through this war," she said. Frank almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Watch me." That was when she understood the unsettling truth. He was not navigating the conflict. He was not trying to escape it, survive it, or profit from it. He intended to break it. One ambush, one nest, one command note at a time. Not because he believed he could rule the ruins. Because he could not tolerate the existence of predators standing over innocence and calling it order. Selene had seen zealots before. Frank Castle was worse. He was disciplined. For the first time in many years, she found herself looking at a human and wondering whether the old war had finally produced something neither side was prepared to face. Once Frank understood the shape of the hidden war, he stopped reacting to it. He began directing it. The first safe house burned just before dawn in the industrial quarter, a converted slaughter facility where vampire logisticians stored blood packs, counterfeit documents, and weapons imported through shell companies. The fire crews never found the trigger system because Frank had built it inside the refrigeration walls. By the time authorities sealed the scene, 3 couriers were dead, a regional accountant had vanished into ash, and half a decade of covert records had been reduced to wet black pulp. The Lycans answered 2 nights later by moving a strike cell through old metro tunnels to hit a vampire transport crossing district lines. They found the convoy already wrecked and the tunnel seeded with directional mines. When they charged through the smoke to claim the kill, Frank detonated the rear access points and turned the passage into a stone coffin. The few survivors clawed their way out hours later to discover their objective gone and their own route burned from his maps. That was how the city changed. Not with one decisive battle, but with a spreading pattern of precision panic. Supply routes failed. Rendezvous points collapsed. Trusted couriers disappeared and reappeared hanging from overpasses with ammunition belts wrapped around their throats. Surveillance teams sent to identify the human hunter returned shredded, shot, or not at all. Ancient rivalries flared because every unexplained sabotage looked like betrayal from within. Frank did not have to overpower an immortal civilization. He only had to make it distrust itself. He understood systems because systems had killed his family long before any monster entered the picture. Criminal empires, bureaucratic corruption, men protected by distance and hierarchy. The supernatural war beneath the city was older, faster, and harder to wound, but it carried the same weakness every predatory order eventually carried. It believed secrecy was strength. Break the secrecy and fear rushed in. So Frank forced everything into the open. He sabotaged a vampire blood processing lab and dumped the contaminated reserves into municipal drains, guaranteeing an investigation too visible to bury. He intercepted Lycan communications, copied route maps, then mailed photographs of their operatives to compromised police units and cartel fixers who had never known what they were truly serving. He hid armored vehicles in broad intersections, timed bombings to trigger traffic cameras, and left bodies where they could not be quietly reclaimed before sunrise. The old war had survived because the human world never saw enough of it at once to believe it. Frank changed that. He became a pressure wave moving through both factions, impossible to predict because he did not think like them. Vampires calculated lineage, leverage, and controlled retaliation. Lycans trusted momentum, territory, and displays of force. Frank targeted whatever kept each side comfortable. A vampire archive hidden in cathedral catacombs. A Lycan munitions cache inside a shipping yard. A broker who sold silver rounds to one side and ultraviolet filters to the other. Anyone feeding the machine became part of the machine. And part of the machine meant killable. Soon both factions did the one thing centuries of hatred had failed to produce. They paused their war long enough to discuss him. In candlelit chambers and concrete dens, commanders reviewed grainy footage of a broad-shouldered human moving through gunfire without hesitation. Some dismissed him as a temporary nuisance, a mortal anomaly who would bleed out eventually. Others argued that he had already done more strategic damage in weeks than rival bloodlines had achieved in generations. He was not stronger than them. That made it worse. If power alone no longer decided outcomes, then every old certainty had become fragile. Frank felt the shift and pressed harder. He attacked during funerals, during transfers, during negotiations conducted under false flags. He used police raids as distractions. He weaponized utility maps, water pressure failures, train schedules, emergency tunnels, and the blind arrogance of immortal beings who had forgotten how vulnerable fixed infrastructure could be. He did not need an army because the city itself became his accomplice. Selene watched the chaos spread with growing unease. Even when his targets were brutal men and worse things wearing human skin, the effects rippled outward. Young vampires were redeployed without guidance. Lycan packs splintered from command and hunted recklessly. Smugglers fled neighborhoods they had quietly controlled, leaving black markets unstable and civilians exposed to the scavengers beneath both thrones. Yet she also saw something undeniable. For the first time in centuries, the hidden war was no longer being defined by superior blood, ancient prophecy, or inherited power. It was being shaped by unpredictability. By a wounded human with demolition tape on his wrists, and an absolute refusal to accept that monsters were entitled to rule the dark, simply because they had done so for a long time. Frank never announced a campaign. He never claimed to be saving the city. He just kept striking until both immortal factions began looking over their shoulders before every meeting, every hunt, every whispered order. They had always believed humans existed below them, useful as livestock, cover, labor, currency. Now, in ruined tunnels and shattered mansions, vampires and Lycans alike were forced to confront a humbling possibility. One man could become more dangerous than their entire ancient war if that man had nothing left to lose and enough discipline to turn hatred into strategy. In the underworld, that realization spread faster than fire. But fire always asks what it is burning. For all the panic Frank unleashed, his victories never changed the oldest truth on the board. He was still flesh, still bone, still limited by blood loss, exhaustion, and the slow betrayal of injuries stitched closed too many times. The monsters whispered about him like a storm, but storms did not limp when the adrenaline wore off. Storms did not wake shaking in abandoned basements because their ribs caught with every breath. Frank did. The proof came after a week of near-constant movement. He had destroyed a vampire relay point, intercepted a Lycan execution crew, and spent 2 straight dawns hiding inside a flooded maintenance vault while daylight above passed over search teams on the street. When he finally surfaced in a deserted apartment block used as a fallback site, he moved like an old man. His side was swollen from a cracked rib. His left shoulder clicked under tension. One eye had not fully reopened after a glancing blow from a Lycan claw. He sat on the floor with medical tape in his teeth and realized his hands were trembling. Not from fear. From depletion. That was when they came for him together. Not as allies, not in trust, but in overlapping calculation. Somebody on the vampire side had traced his supply thefts. Somebody among the Lycans had identified his rest pattern. They did not need a treaty. They only needed the same destination on the same night. Frank heard the entry charges below and knew instantly what had happened. Too many footsteps. Too many angles. Not a hunt. An enclosure. He moved before the first wall blew inward, grabbing the duffel, the shotgun, the remote trigger pack. Glass burst through the hall. Automatic fire stitched the plaster behind him. Then the whole corridor shook as something enormous hit the stairwell from the opposite side, not climbing but smashing its way upward. The apartment block became a grinder. Vampire rounds tore through doors with disciplined bursts while Lycans crashed through load-bearing walls in sprays of dust and brick. Frank fought room to room, forcing choke points, abandoning traps half-finished because there was no time to shape the battlefield the way he wanted. He killed a vampire in a kitchen with boiling oil and silver shards. He crippled a Lycan with a freezer door jammed into its knee joint. He dropped a stair landing with plastique and sent 3 attackers into the floor below. None of it was enough. There were too many. By the time he reached the roof, his breathing had turned ragged and wet. Moonlight silvered broken concrete. The city stretched around him in indifferent lights, full of people sleeping through a war they would never believe until it swallowed them whole. Frank limped toward the service shed at the center of the rooftop, knowing the emergency zipline rig there was unfinished. Knowing the fallback route beyond it required a jump his body might no longer make. The first vampire hit him from behind like a steel cable. They rolled across the roof in a blur of fists and shattered gravel. Frank drove a knife upward, felt it bite, then lost it when another shape slammed into both of them from the side. Claws. He A Lycan's jaws snapped inches from his face. He jammed his forearm against its throat and felt tendons strain toward failure. The wounded vampire rose again, bleeding black, eyes bright with murder. For one impossible second, Frank was pinned between both species, each trying to kill him while hating the other more. Then gunfire split the dark from a neighboring roof and the moment broke. Frank never saw the shooter clearly. Only silhouettes, confusion, a breath of opening where instinct screamed, "Move now." He kicked free, stumbled to the ledge, hit the emergency release, and rode the half-anchored line across open air as rounds snapped past him and the cable screamed under his weight. He crashed through the window of a derelict office tower and blacked out before he hit the floor. When he woke, it was daylight bleeding through cracked blinds. Every part of him hurt. For a long time he could do nothing except breathe and listen to the city. Distant sirens, water in old pipes, a child laughing somewhere many floors below. Human sounds, fragile sounds. The kind monsters learn to ignore after enough centuries because ordinary life seemed too brief to matter. Frank lay in the dust and understood a truth he had refused to say aloud. He could not win this war by killing faster than it replaced itself. There were too many nests, too many cells, too many centuries of buried infrastructure beneath every victory. He could wreck routes and shatter factions and fill tunnels with bodies, but if the civilians above remained exposed, then all he was doing was changing which monsters reached them first. That realization did not soften him. It sharpened him differently. He began noticing the collateral he had once pushed to the edge of his vision. The night shift nurse going missing after taking a shortcut near a contested district. The family burned out of a tenement when vampires torched evidence too close to street level. The migrant children used as lookouts by gangs who did not know they were serving Lycans. The hidden war was not hidden from its victims, only from everyone powerful enough to stop it. So Frank changed the mission. Punishment remained. It always would. But protection moved to the center. Safe corridors, witness routes, evacuation maps. He started breaking up transport chains, carrying human captives instead of using them as bait for larger strikes. He cached weapons for trusted civilians and moved informants before either faction could retaliate. For the first time since entering the Underworld, he was no longer trying only to make monsters pay. He was trying to make sure somebody survived them, and that made the war personal in an entirely new way. Once Frank stopped treating the conflict like an endless field of targets, patterns emerged that had been harder to see through blood and smoke. Neither faction truly depended on raw numbers. They depended on structure. Orders passed through hidden relays. Old loyalties were reinforced by fear, ritual, and controlled information. Elite vampires insulated elders from exposure while lieutenants coordinated feeding routes, logistics, and retaliation cells. Lycan commanders held their packs together through charisma, access to weapons, territorial discipline, and the promise that every death still served a larger future. Destroy random soldiers and the war continued. Break the joints connecting command to action, and the whole monstrous body began to seize. So Frank shifted from hunter to saboteur of hierarchy. He started with communication. A vampire signal broker vanished from a safe apartment overlooking the river, leaving behind 3 severed hardlines, a burned server rack, and a message carved into the desk with a combat blade. A Lycan radio hub operating out of an auto-dismantling yard exploded during a command relay, taking encrypted sets, generators, and 2 regional coordinators with it. Couriers disappeared on routes Frank had mapped weeks earlier. Backup channels surfaced only to find dead drops poisoned, tunnels collapsed, or meeting houses emptied minutes before arrival because somebody had fed their location to the other side. Paranoia did the rest. Leaders who once moved with confidence now questioned every summons. Every delay looked like betrayal. Every failed interception smelled like an informant. The immortals had survived for centuries by controlling what their subordinates knew. Frank weaponized that same instinct until both factions were staring inward with more suspicion than they aimed outward. Then he escalated. He identified the figures whose deaths would not merely hurt morale, but fracture legitimacy. A vampire elder who controlled blood distribution through black clinics and private hospitals. A Lycan commander whose authority held 3 restless packs from turning on each other. A financier laundering cash through shipping insurers and church charities. A chemist manufacturing specialized rounds for hunters who thought they worked only for organized crime. Frank did not hit them all at once. He hit them in sequence with just enough time between strikes for fear to grow roots. The elder died in a candlelit archive when ultraviolet charges detonated inside the ventilation shafts and sealed the exits in white fire. The Lycan commander bled out beneath an elevated highway after Frank collapsed the concrete support where his convoy paused every third night for a security transfer. The financier vanished from his armored car between traffic cameras, and pieces of his record surfaced in police hands, criminal hands, tabloid hands, each leak calibrated to ruin trust more effectively than a bomb. The city's underworld convulsed. Without clear leadership, ambitious lieutenants advanced too quickly. Young vampires mistook cruelty for control and overreached into visible territory. Lycan packs split over old grudges that Central Command had suppressed for years. Patrol lines overlapped. Retribution strikes multiplied. Informal alliances collapsed by the hour. Frank watched the unraveling from safe rooms and rooftops, battered notebooks open beside stolen radios, and knew the war was finally bending. But bending was not the same as ending. The first sign came in districts he had never intended to touch. Corner stores extorted by unaffiliated scavengers. Apartment blocks raided by splinter packs with no command discipline left to restrain feeding. Human gangs arming themselves with looted silver and homemade ultraviolet rigs, launching reckless attacks against anything rumored to be supernatural and often hitting the wrong targets. Old order had been monstrous. New disorder was simply hungry. Selene confronted him again after a massacre in a tram tunnel left civilians and Lycans dead together, none of them high value, none of them central to either side's power. She found Frank loading magazines in a maintenance chamber lined with route maps and photographs. He looked thinner than before, more ghost than soldier, but his eyes were unchanged. "You are breaking the war," she said. "That was the idea," Frank answered. She stepped closer, anger held on a leash. "And what replaces it?" For once, he had no immediate reply. Because he had seen it too. The terrible vacuum that opened when tyrannies cracked before anything steadier could stand in their place. He had lived that lesson in other forms, in other cities, among cartels and militias and power brokers whose deaths made room for smaller monsters. Moral arithmetic was easy at the point of a rifle, harder in the aftermath. Still, Frank could not regret the dead leaders. They had built their kingdoms on human suffering. Leaving them in place would only preserve a more efficient evil. Yet now the consequences were multiplying faster than bodies could explain. End the command structures and violence spread. Spare them, and the ancient machine continued feeding in disciplined silence. It was the closest thing to despair the underworld had offered him. Not fear of dying, fear of being right and still making everything worse. So he adapted again. Instead of striking for maximum destruction, he began steering collapse. He leaked targets to rival cells likely to cannibalize each other rather than civilians. He protected transit corridors at specific hours so families and night workers could move while predators fought over territory elsewhere. He sabotaged ammunition, transport, and intelligence more often than bodies. He pushed the war into bottlenecks where monsters consumed monsters and the city above bought another day of breathing room. It was uglier than victory and more honest than fantasy. Frank Castle was not ending darkness. He was managing its direction with bloody hands, trying to force a centuries-old nightmare to spend itself against stronger parts of its own skeleton. And in quiet moments, when the radios dimmed and dawn threatened the edges of the roofs, he understood the most terrifying truth of all. Sometimes breaking the system was easy. Living with the shattered pieces was the real war. By the time winter rain began washing the soot from Budapest's stone, the hidden war still existed. But it no longer belonged to those who had ruled it for centuries. Vampires changed their routes twice before crossing district lines. Lycan packs sent scouts ahead of scouts, testing doorways, rooftops, and sewer mouths as if the city itself had become carnivorous. Meetings once held in confidence moved constantly or did not happen at all. No elder admitted fear. No commander spoke Frank Castle's name unless the room was sealed. Yet fear had settled into both bloodlines all the same, cold and permanent. Because somewhere beyond the next tunnel bend, somewhere above the next safe house ceiling, there might be a human waiting with silver, fire, maps, and patience. That possibility changed everything. He moved mostly at night, a broad shape crossing rooftops under sodium light, vanishing into church ruins, drainage corridors, condemned stations, and half-flooded basements where old empires went to hide their mistakes. Civilians told stories about a ghost in body armor who appeared before kidnappings, before raids, before unexplained fires in buildings the police were too afraid to enter. Criminals whispered that if the skull found your door, dawn would not save you. The supernatural faction said less, which meant more. Selene saw him only once after the command networks fractured. He was standing at the edge of a bridge, looking down at black water moving under the city. For a moment he seemed almost still enough to be mistaken for an ordinary man, just another tired figure alone with his thoughts. Then he turned and the illusion vanished. There was too much intent in him, too much unfinished judgment. "The war is still here," she said. Frank looked back toward the sleeping districts beyond the river. "You cannot kill the night." His answer came quiet and absolute. "But I can make it afraid to move." And that was what he became in the underworld. Not prey, not rival, not even hunter in the old sense. He became consequence, a human-shaped answer to centuries of hidden feeding, secret treaties, bloodline arrogance, and the casual belief that ordinary people existed to be used by stronger things. He did not end the darkness. He marked it, wounded it, forced it to remember that beneath every myth of immortal dominance stood a simpler law. If monsters hunted the helpless long enough, eventually something human would rise from the suffering and hunt them back. So the night endured. But now, when vampires whispered and Lycans listened, they spoke of a truth more unsettling than silver or sunlight. In the deepest hours, when the city went silent and ancient predators felt movement where no fear should be, the underworld no longer asked what stalked in darkness. It asked whether Frank Castle was already there,